start. Okay, great. Thank you. Welcome to our Poetics panel. Let's see, I'm Susan Vanderborg. I'm an associate professor of English at the University of South Carolina, and my research interests are print and digital experimental poetry, book art, sci-fi, and horror. A little bit of all of them in this paper. My paper actually reads a zombie movie as an avant-garde poetics discussion, because why not? Okay, few texts have developed William Burroughs, a very heavily Burroughs influenced film. Few texts have developed William Burroughs' premise of language as an alien virus, both in reinterpreting the virus's evolution and its potential cure via defamiliarization techniques, as intensely as Tony Burgess's novel Pontypool Changes Everything, 1995, which was adapted as the 2008 Pontypool film and a 2009 radio drama, also simply Pontypool. Burgess's zombifying language virus, each of its victims infected via a specific word that triggers them, manifests in or as poetic forms. In Burgess's exploration of the limits of avant-garde poetic techniques of both aesthetic and political resistance during the Anthropocene. Looking at the original novel title, Changes certainly seemed to suggest a transformative experimentation. But in Gertrude Stein's terms, from Tender Buttons, what happens when, quote, the difference is spreading? If you change everything, Burgess suggests, if avant-garde poetic techniques become familiar viral memes divorced from their original context and critiques, whether that situation has their beat or language, then an experimental vanguard disappears, leaving only fossilized zombie language, perhaps why Burgess's title, post-novel, reverts simply to the town name. My focus on Burgess's sense of the limits of experimental poetry, I think, is going against at least some of the readings that celebrate the possibility of a cure to the zombie infection via different language practices. That's a cure that is very much proposed in the film, but not in the original novel or the radio script. The movie's plot, based on part of the book, takes place in a small town's radio station where DJ Grant Massey, technician Laurel Ann, and producer Sidney Breyer get increasing reports of and exposure to the zombifying virus, AMP, acquired metastructural pediculosis. And the last word jumps from the micro to the macrosphere with the language virus imaged as, or now as common as, infesting lice. If the virus transfers only when we cognitively comprehend a word, it's a neat mechanism. Grant and Sidney, the two surviving characters, appear to save themselves at the end by word reversals and paratactic jumbles. Kirsch and Stancliffe, who note the virally, quote, alliterative and homophonic slippage in Grant's opening monologue, which may have jump-started the town's infection, nevertheless differentiates it from the wordplay in the cure passages, particularly in the closing dialogue, which is an exchange of single words with Sidney. Those two describe it as an anarchic, perhaps poetic abandonment of consensus, that is, Kirsch and Stancliffe, leading to a liberated outlawed poetic space in the end credits scene. Pexon describes the cure as trying to, quote, evade rhetoric, eradicating all pre-existing meaning and replacing it with a new semantic system based on actions. As when Grant declares that kill is now kiss, followed by kissing Sidney to disrupt her infection. And Pexon sees it as having ties to the irony and partiality of Donna Haraway's cyborg writing, leading to post-human free play beyond the Anthropocene. So these are kind of readings with a lot of optimism and the possibility to cure. But I kind of keep coming back to the fact that Burgess, who wrote novel, film, screenplay, and radio script, is working from Burroughs, indeed extending him. Where Burroughs saw the language as an alien parasite creating a history of human warfare and eco-destruction, Burgess's novel goes further. It establishes the virus as Earth's original life form, kind of parodying Anthropocene tropes of DNA as an alphabet humans can easily rewrite in crops and dreams of designer babies in biopoetry. In the novel's eco-history, however, once humans evolve and recognize, quote, themselves as copy machines, that virus switches hosts, quote, from the imperiled species, and that's a clear reference to mass extinctions in the Anthropocene, quote, into the imperious one, by, at least at the level of this passage, the metonymic poetic play of the devilish imp sounds in both words, with the virus spreading only via English, a language of imperialism. What starts in Pontypool in the movie spreads backwards to the Commonwealth country to once imperial England, and perhaps north of the border to the US and its imperial uses. It's also a virus that happily anticipated neoliberalism's frantic production and consumption cycles, quote, farming organisms into complexity like Disney World, as Burgess writes in the novel, quote, and the victim produces the virus, again, via the play on the opening VI letters before moving on to consume other victims' mouths. The cycle is portrayed with very deliberate allusions to poetry techniques in the novel. Quote, his thinking, Burgess writes of one character, has become deformed in repetitions and crude rhymes. It's as if the infection had been lurking all along in poetry's long-standing play with the materiality of signifiers, with form and its innovative deformations. Maybe the virus seduces just as much by this play as by understanding words' meaning. Most scholars writing on the Pontypool text mention the virus as slippery language play, but seem less prone to describe it as opposed to the cure in poetic terms. Yet the English antecedents for the novel's devilish language shifts, not just imp, but in case we miss the demonic connotations, overt plays on hell, hello, Helen, help, as it infects residents, might be Milton's Poetics, reflecting human language as hellishly fallen and elusive, allusive in its puns, double entendres, its sound and letter play. You know, as when they called me sin and for a sign portentous held me. If poetry seems the epitome of the virus, can it also offer the cure? The problem is that even in the film's hope for a cure, Pontypool's viral symptoms and cure passages sound and look very similar. Kill is kiss, happy is handy, yellow is crowded, sharing that OW, and the closing word stream entries like sausage, savage, money, and monologue all have the same metonymic repetition of letters that we've seen in passages about the virus or by the infected. Indeed, the Pontypool texts enact a mini-parodic history of innovative poetry and poetics, from Sidney's critique of Grant's initial experiments as, quote, shitty haiku, perhaps a satirical dig at Imagism's influences. Grant's query about a word, quote, how do you make it strange, is both a twist on the modernist mantra, make it new, and straight-up Russian formalism, poetic defamiliarization from Shklovsky. Even the word rhinoceros, seemingly unlinked to other sound play in the closing word exchange. Here, let me just share that for a second. All right, in case you're interested in what that looks like. Yeah, okay. Even the word rhinoceros, which is seemingly unlinked to other sound play in the closing word exchange, is a minimalist collage allusion to Ionesco's play, where the central character watches the whole town get rhinocerized with no cure in sight. Pexon sees this allusion as a reference to the problem to be fought. I find it more disturbing that it appears in a cure passage. Burgess's novel is much more explicit about an experimental poetry problem. Okay, I think we can stop sharing. Okay, he is much more explicit about an experimental poetry problem in the novel. If some characters resort to associative wordplay to fight the virus, others think that the Dadaists started the whole contagion. And in a Burroughs-infused text, the viral word jumbles also echo the phrasal juxtapositions of Burroughs's cut-up poetics that were intended to resist the virus. Tristan Tzara's original recipe for a charming Dadaist poem, after all, built by cutting up and rearranging words from a newspaper article, is one inspiration for Geisen and Burroughs's cut-up techniques. One might also think of language poetry's disjunctive phrasal associations in the 1970s and 80s that were designed to challenge the passive consumption of text, the ideological hegemony of grammar under capitalism. Having the virus assimilate various avant-garde poetic techniques leads to the Burroughsian suspicion that maybe only silence is safe. Deshane and Morton feel Pontypool's message, quote, is not to stop speaking or isolate ourselves through quarantine, but to embrace the marginalized other. But maybe silence is the point. Burroughs uses the cut-up technique to create, as he puts it near the end of The Ticket That Exploded, quote, the silence to say goodbye, which is different from words emptied and recreated. What about kill is kiss, which Pexon saw getting new meaning from Grant's actual kiss? But we can't just choose to make love not war poetry. Kiss as an action prefacing romance and sex has always been tied to kill from Burroughs's point of view. Our love is a production process for making more language hosts for the virus's, quote, ugly spirit. Kiss and kill take on grimmer contextual meanings in Burgess's radio play. There isn't a cure. Grant kills Sidney because he can't stop her from talking and infecting him. Again, it's telling that for all the movie's cure hope, none of Burgess's Pontypool text eschews words but keeps repeating and proliferating, even as the author explains those proliferations in avant-garde rhetoric. Quote, "I wanted something new," he writes of the novel to film adaptation. The radio drama spawned a stage play. The Pontypools take inspiration both from repeating and enhancing Burroughs, and some posters have speculated a 1986 Twilight Zone episode, Need to Know, which probably is also Burroughs influenced. The Pontypool movie ends with the station attacked and soldiers shooting as Grant is trying to transmit what they think the cure might be, only to have him and Sydney reappear firily, ghostfully, in a dreamlike after image in the post-credits sequence, a place that typically, as commentators have pointed out well, sets up a sequel, which may or may not have in fact led to another movie, Dreamland, where the actor who played Grant now plays a character with Grant's transformed credits name, Johnny Deadeyes, another mortality emphasizing signifier. In an introduction to Burgess's Bewdley Mayhem, Jonathan Ball talks about the characteristic blurring between the metaphoric and the literal in Burgess's quote, poetic horror, where the reader, in other words, is never really certain if something is actually happening or just symbolically. The poetic metaphor matters, becomes matter, if usually inert matter, since as Ball also notes, most stories in that volume end with at least, or begin in some cases with at least one dead body. Yet Burgess deals less invisibly illuminating images. Again, scholars have definitely noted the film's shift from visual to oral transmission of horror. Rather, Burgess's images echo Daniel Tiffany's description of Pound's avant-garde imagism in Radio Corpse, which is a book published the same year as Pontypool. Tiffany reads imagism as a haunted poetics of dead bodies, transmitting via the invisible sublimation associated with radioactive contamination, that older pop trope cause for zombification. But Tiffany himself doesn't spend too much time with zombies. Quote, "A discourse of radio pictures," that's how he describes Pound's image. "Not darkness visible," he says, another Milton check-in, but the light of reason made invisible and displaced along the magnetic spectrum. And then into the fascist Rome broadcast that sought to infect or convert their listeners. If Pontypool keeps satirically recalling avant-garde techniques, it's notable that one symptom of the virus is that the victim's verbal repetition becomes déjà vu, so that any new experimental occurrence seems to have already happened. And that might not only preclude the experience of an avant-garde is truly novel, but also recent avant-garde poetic uses of obsolescence to resist some of the forms of digitized capitalism, as Brian Reed and Jessica Pressman have discussed. Burgess's virus, even in its later iterations, spreads not through internet memes, which you'd expect, or social media or computer gaming, but via more retro forms like radio. Burgess's own radio play script travels backward along our media paths, ending with Grant infected via the word paper, that he can't stop saying, paper, paper, shit, trap, with all the investment of Beckett's own fecally evocative crap, repeating the sensual sound of a tape word at the end of Krapp's last tape in 1958, spool, a word, too, that anticipates Burroughs, his hope that tape might capture and then be used to cut up the language virus. In the Pontypool film, the BBC broadcaster infected with the word Pontypool itself breaks it in two, the repeated pool sounding like a truncated version of Krapp's spool. For all the satiric avant-garde references, and there are many, I don't think Burgess denies the effect of experimentation. He clearly relishes the done sound play of his disjunctive metaphors. There's shock and delight with the possibility of, quote, something new, as Dr. Mendes says, and Vanguard echoes again, at least in the viral line, in which torsos along with tickets might explode. But the Pontypool texts are also simultaneously a cautionary tale, as poet Brian Fawcett memorably wrote in the Language Journal. Quote, "It isn't good enough to press the conviction that if everybody could practice parataxis, the structures that make our lives so awful would crumble. So yes, try charting your own language cure, but the Anthropocene disease may still amp up and co-opt it." As for unironic poetic production, straight-up lyricism, in Burroughs at least, it was only possible for the non-human. Burroughs writes in Ghost of Chance. Bulldozers are destroying the rainforest, the cowering lemurs and flying foxes, the singing Claus's gibbons, which produce the most beautiful and variegated music of any land animal. That doesn't even sound like Burroughs, but it is. There wasn't an anti-Anthropocene cure for us in that book. We just unleash viruses that wipe out our civilization. Any survivors devolve, reverting back to what Burgess would call the imperiled species, especially lemurs. None of the Pontypool texts, however, get that vision of a redeemed earth. Some still humans survive in Burgess's novel since communication has been outlawed except for nods, and animals remain as background vision and noise, a cat, a bird, a moth, an owl. Is it enough? As the novel's last line has a character ask, now what? Are there new language games that might jolt us out of our overhunting, overproduction, overconsumption? If the language virus precedes our attempts at biopoetry, what poetics might let the non-human sound through? I'm a thing, Grant says near the end of the radio script, that may not have even happened on paper, that might not have been. But he's infected, and trace memory persists in the supposed negation of self and medium. What new Cajun silences, or at least poetic pauses, might we imagine constructing in their place instead? For right now, though, I suspect the Pontypool scripts aren't going anywhere other than viral. Okay, thank you. Great. All right, thanks. Our next panelist is Christiane Tarantino. She's a PhD candidate in communication and culture at Toronto Metropolitan University. There's Nothing Here, Reimagining Suburbia Through Poetry is a collaborative presentation with her doctoral supervisor, Dr. Irene Gammo.
Thank you so much, Susan. Wonderful welcome and really wonderful presentation. That was so cool to listen to, especially considering it's a Southern Ontario setting. But yeah, so I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Is everything looking all right on?
Looking great.
Okay. So with that, I'm just going to jump right in. There's a slight change to our presentation title. It's called There's Nothing Here, Reimagining Suburbia Through Subway Poetry. So with that, here we go. East York, Old York, North York, Fort York, Royal York, York Regional Police. In his poem Islington, Toronto poet Adrian de Leon uses anaphora and blank space to bridge Old York with York Region, poetically connecting the downtown with the suburb. Youthful and raw, experimental and irreverent, the 2018 poetry collection by Manila-born Adrian de Leon stages the names of the subway stations as a poetic rhetoric is a thorough unraveling. First, of the historical and cultural power of naming a territory or a landmark, and second, of the relationship between downtown and suburb, blurring the lines between inside and outside, center and periphery. De Leon's subway poetry reminds us of the concept of the ghostly twin city, meaning the suburb is always the downtown's darker, neglected, forgotten, or denigrated shadow, as theorized by Christine Vogt-Williams. This poetry contributes to the 20th century tradition of subway literature with its focus on mobility and radical experimentation, navigating also the embodied relationship between city and suburb. As Elizabeth Gross writes in her essay Body Cities, the city is the site of the body's cultural saturation, the place where the body is representationally re-explored, transformed, contested, reinscribed. This urban body consistently extends the limits and the borders of the city into and beyond the suburban. Canadian urban scholars like Cheryl Cowdy, Roger Keel, and G.C. Zhuang have noted that the suburb's association with horizontal sprawl contrasts the verticality of the city's skyscrapers. With this backdrop, we argue that de Leon's collection contests the static white suburban literature that dominated in Canada in the wake of the Second World War, and he does so with an explicit immigrant focus. Specifically, he recasts the immigrant suburban experience as an alternative history of Toronto through an embodied odyssey of mobility. Ultimately, we argue the commute between suburb and city represents a radical poetic nexus to give voice to the marginalized stories and experiences, with Rouge as a crucible of cross-cultural convergence. The poem that opens the collection is titled Kipling, Toronto's most western terminal subway station, which is also the closest subway station to the Pearson International Airport, with an express bus connecting back and forth. Thus, the poetry situates the reader at the place of the immigrant's arrival in Canada, setting the stage for de Leon's irreverent parody of the Western literary tradition with his parody invocation of the subway journey home. Oh, for a muse that grinds these gears, from arcane shafts dispel my fears. The tunnel shaft, to be precise, the wellspring of our transit's might. Most immediately, the first verse mocks the opening line of Homer's Odyssey, Tell me, muse, of that man of many resources who wandered far and wide. De Leon's 21st century muse is the public transit system, the wellspring of our transit's might. There is mystery and fear surrounding the phallic shafts. Being conventionally vertical, here the shaft is horizontal, affording motion and a passageway. The poet's subway ride becomes generative, resurfacing old and obscured meaning while also creating new meaning. Kipling is named after Rudyard Kipling, an icon of British colonialism, and is succeeded by stations Islington, Royal York, Runnymede, and Dundas West, and so on. Named after actual British location, these titles take the traveler deep into a history of settlement. The 9th station and the 9th poem in the collection is Dundas West, recalling Henry Dundas, the British politician and Home Secretary, associated with the support of slavery and the slave trade, remembered also for his role in delaying the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire. From the immigrant speaker's perspective, these names and histories afford the opportunity to create a counter-narrative. Runnymede, for example, is subtitled A Found Poem, the speaker revealing his concern with poetic method. Oh, what a nightmare. Jesus, she's tiny. A little good, a lot of awe. Stand back. Your safety matters to us. Erin was thrilled her son had made an invisible friend at the daycare. She had just wished it wasn't the flu. Security cameras. The next station is. Like a found object in art, Runnymede uses banal, snatched-up fragments of conversation and instructions. The verbal interactions, along with the instructions like, stand back, your safety matters to us, perform the subway station as a social space. Runnymede is a space of convergence and divergence of commuters, of simultaneous connection and disconnection. These verbal fragments challenge conventional understandings of poetry by elevating the everyday object into the poetic imagination. Leaving the final sentence incomplete, the next station is, as passengers exit the train, this counter-poetry gains power as a rhetorical and cultural provocation in this assemblage of fragments. The poetry performs itself as a self-conscious anti-art or anti-poetry, defying refinement and sleek urban ideals. The first-person speaker's casting himself as a transgressor and rule breaker is made explicit in Lansdowne. Located on the cusp between suburb and downtown on Line 2, Bloor Danforth, an area known for its small businesses, cafes, and shops. It's me again. I'm breaking the rules by writing this in a coffee shop, wide open window compared to the dreary subway grays of the past 6 hours. Everyone needs to see Lansdowne once in their life. This is real dilapidation. Beautiful. Like Odysseus, who stops at the seductive land of the lotus eaters, but resists temptation to stay in comfort, instead choosing to return to the struggle of the journey homeward, the speaker here also refuses to stay. He continues his subway journey in the homeward direction, which for De Leon himself is Scarborough on the eastern side. Each station presents a new opportunity for revamping his strategies, renovating the existing structures as he goes. A decade ago, Dufferin Station underwent a large-scale renovation with new signage, new elevators, and art installations, and this becomes the focus in his poem Dufferin, subtitled Danger, Construction in Progress. The poem itself is composed through the repetition of the name Dufferin, constructing a poem object that works through materiality and visuality. The dramatic white space mimics the construction holes, with the entire poem configuring the physical squareness of the neighborhood, a well-known Toronto immigrant area with Little Italy and Little Portugal at its center. The station is named after Dufferin Street, a major north-south artery that connects the downtown Toronto to the suburbs of Vaughan. With its 14 lines, the length of a sonnet, De Leon creates a love poem to the early aesthetics of the suburb, which work through architectural replication of the same housing structures, just as his poem is built through the replication of the word Dufferin. Like Dufferin, St. Andrew, the poem seen here on the right, also represents the city as a square. However, De Leon refrains from describing the actual station. Instead, he focuses on the discursive enmeshment as it represents, quote, the financial districts, Toronto's ground zero for law firms and investment banks, a description drawn from Blog TO. As the speaker continues his journey, he is drawn to Little Koreatown, a neighborhood of ethnic restaurants, embracing the spice while rejecting the glitter and the glamour of Yorkville, and embracing the Odyssey moving through east of the dawn. Here, close to the downtown, in the poem Bathurst, he reflects on Markham as a touchstone. It's a street name that appears in both urban and suburban contexts. He calls out the deep disconnect between the two, referring to them as the foreign lands beyond the trains where tracks will never meet. This is because Markham Street is located in the downtown. Markham Road is located in the suburb of Scarborough, and Markham itself its own independent suburb. De Leon's focus on the foreign lands is both ironic and focused on recasting the suburb as a space for stories and for poetry. While De Leon's collection describes 6 separate rides, our focus today is on the Green Line, the homecoming line, from Kipling Terminal Station to Scarborough, where the poet resides. He takes a detour into the downtown core, as seen here on this loop on the yellow line, and it's a journey that unravels personal history and anger. The anger is verbalized most explicitly at Osgood subway station in a free-writing memoir style. Quote, "My dad used to work here. We rose to power, to middle class, the Canadian dream, and I grew up hearing the word Osgood like it was a Greek god." De Leon's poetry is anti-institutional, a counter-narrative to Osgood's high status, critically dismantling the institution of Canadian justice with his own family narrative and life with the city. In turning his back on the downtown core, De Leon's primary focus is on the periphery of the city. His poetry offers embodied details, giving voice to the often forgotten places and its residents. This poetic practice turns these places into spaces. Places represent the official map, the stable, the static, and the ideologically informed. But spaces are embodied places through practices such as subway rides and subway poetry. In other words, spaces represent the tactic of space making, wherein the idea of space involves inserting the personal narrative. So for the rest of this presentation, we will focus on the homecoming rides on line 2, which is still running on old tracks with old cars, whereas the other lines on our subway system have been upgraded and modernized or even decommissioned. Line 2 includes the first and the final journeys of this entire collection, describing the trajectory moving from west to east. As the collection ends with the speaker's homecoming in Scarborough, it does so with 2 titles, both titled Rouge. These are the only poems in the collection that don't take their names from subway stations, but rather from the Rouge River running through the eastern edge of Scarborough. Rouge is the most northeastern part of Toronto, a district where 57% of the population are first-generation immigrants, including East Indians, Sri Lankans, Filipinos, and Jamaicans. Rouge becomes a fluid space where cultures merge to become a new hybrid culture. But it's also a space that fights against prejudice. Rouge takes the speaker to Danzig Avenue, the site of a gang shooting in 2012 that the collection responds to. De Leon evokes the trauma in fragmented syntax, grammar, and narration in the pop, pop, pop of shots and the bodies that hit the ground. The poem's blank space pays tribute to the dead in rhythmic lines, marking the poem as one of commemoration. At the same time, for De Leon, this episode is a crucial way of fighting against the sidelining and the denigration of the suburb. His poem explicitly twins and intertwines suburban violence with gang violence in the downtown core. He calls out not the Rouge shooting victims, but the name of 15-year-old victim of the Boxing Day Eaton Center shooting in 2005, Jane Kreba. Quote, "Bullets do not choose a victim," he writes, his poem refuting the reporter's arsenal, the rhetorical scandal, and the gory details. In other words, De Leon's poetry performs the task of recasting, subverting, and contesting the deeply embedded, sensationalized rhetoric that unfairly criminalizes the suburban immigrant population. In conclusion, by practicing the mobility of the subway, De Leon powerfully defies the borders of the city and the suburb. This in turn aligns him with the subway poetry of early 20th century poets like Langston Hughes and his poem Subway, which uses the subway's mobility to celebrate not only the rhythm of the city, but the voices of Black Americans, as well as connecting the border between white Manhattan and Harlem. It also aligns him with data poetry of German expat, the Baroness Elsa, in her 1921 poem, Subjoyride, satirically mocking the emerging consumer culture. Like these poets, Dulion is fueled by his desire for renovating poetry. His immigrant speaker come subway commuter provokes a new radical look at the public transit system's commemorative naming. It challenges the cultural, the political, and the historical inequities these subway stations represent. His focus is on the poetic word and its rhetorical power, which in his hands becomes a tool to make space of place by intertwining the familiar and the unfamiliar place with new stories and new aesthetics and even anti-aesthetics. In his hands, subway poetry is ultimately a tool to renovate, reconfigure, and rewrite the long ingrained discourses attached to them: the colonial, the economic, the political, and the social. In this process, he is making space new for the poet and for his suburban community of readers, but also for the downtown dwellers who get to know these foreign lands beyond the trains. Thank you. Just stop sharing this screen. Oh, thank you.
Thanks, that was fantastic. Okay, our third panelist, Matthew W. Baker, currently lives in Texas, where he's pursuing a PhD in literature from the University of Texas at Dallas. He received his MFA from the University of Nevada at Reno. He's the author of Undoing the Hide's Taut Musculature, 2019, and other work appears in Muzzle Magazine, the Southern Review, the Atlanta Review, and Booth Journal, among others.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to you and Christiane for those presentations. Those are great. I'm like super jazzed to ask questions after this. So let me just get into this. So I have a few slides to share. I'll just put that on the screen as I read. So let me do that real quick. Boop, boop, boop. Okay, cool. All right, great. So this presentation is called Hybridity as Form Towards a Poetics of Disarticulation and Orientation. And this is sort of an excerpt from a chapter I'm working on in my dissertation right now. All right. When Cole Swenson and David St. John endorse hybrid aesthetics in their anthology, American Hybrid, they embrace a politics of utopianism that imagines formal mixtures as a democratic playing field. In other words, each form is equal in that it may be used in a conventional way or in a new way in a different context, unchained from that history. Thinking of forms as things that perform work in different ways depending on their contexts is admirable, and I would argue correct, because it allows for invention. However, Rachel Greenwald Smith would call this process of creation, quote, entrepreneurial. Another way to phrase it is to say that forms used in this manner become tools to fuel the self-producing, market-based impulse in artistic expression that Greenwald Smith warns against. In other words, hybridity thought of this way, even if it does invent new objects, may offer no alternative approach to language and can still result in the original problem, a lyric or an anti-lyric that prioritizes above all else a representation of the self or one's individual experience of an object, which can be a problem if we want poetry to help us understand social, economic, and class differences societies face communally. But while Greenwald Smith's argument revolves around the problem of a commodity form of poetry, I will argue here that the conversation should pivot from a discussion of hybridity as such in favor of a reinvigorated debate about form itself and the political potential of work that insists on creating an aesthetic space separate from the physical space in which the reader exists. What I assert instead is that reframing the discussion of hybridity into one focused on poetic form and its relation to space, namely its ability to represent space while simultaneously creating a separate aesthetic space not part of the reader's physical world, will allow us to better see how the forms used to create and manipulate language can also teach readers how to interrogate those forms that structure spaces in their physical worlds. By taking time to interrogate the form and shape of poems, readers engage in what I call an act of disarticulation. To disarticulate means to disrupt the logic of something. A disruption in the logic of a space brought about by the form of the line or the rhythm of the language can offer a glimpse into the fabric of how a reader is being directed. Disarticulation, therefore, involves a queering of space, or what I call a bringing awareness to how poetic language engages in a process of lining. Some recent books of hybrid poetry investigate the speaker's relationship to place and how it can change over time. That's like an understatement. Poets like Brian Tier and Layli Long Soldier, in their pieces Tall Flat Sedge Notebook and We, respectively, use citational techniques and visual cues to not only blend different forms of writing, but also to bring attention to the constructedness of their poems. By blending academic, visual, metatextual, and poetic languages that simulate a separation of literal and aesthetic realms, Tier and Long Soldier exemplify the kind of disarticulation and orientation for which I call. So let me skip to some Brian Tier, because I'll talk about him next. All right. Tall Flat Sedge Notebook appears at the end of the first section of Brian Tier's Companion Grasses. In the poem, Tier infuses his imagism with theoretical language and alters the look of the page by fashioning it as if it were field notes one may find in a biologist's notebook. In the poem, the speaker walks the trail at Chimney Rock, Point Reyes National Seashore and stops along the way to listen to the sounds of the flora and the fauna around him. But as the piece moves forward, this landscape is juxtaposed to the less inviting, more disruptive atmosphere of San Francisco. What results from this confluence is an attempt to embed the reader in the different places, but rather than becoming a completely immersive experience, the poem's notational style, which includes citations in the margins and meta-commentary on the process of writing, marks it as an object aware of how it occupies a different space than the world it observes. What I will argue here is that Tier's aesthetic approach suggests that what builds the bridge between a person and a new subject is not merely language, but rather the way that language is framed. Tier's formal transformation of the page into a field note allows him to create a sense of immersion that borders on the dissolution of the self. In the first section of the poem, readers are thrust into the space of the trail by the field note-like appearance of the title and the place marker, but later, more sensually, by the imagery and sounds. The speaker comments that as he walks, he feels, quote, so inside experience, he writes the wrong date down, noticing no thought but things. And inside that experience, the speaker notices mostly the sounds around him. Phrases like coastal prairie poised pre-spring, a prosody, and bright brown birdsong in back of one bee, far barking seals, represent energy bursting from the environment. By not only conjuring the visuals of plants and animals, but also their sounds as the speaker hears them, Tier enacts the poem's imagistic goal by drowning readers in the feel of the trail. However, rather than allowing the poem to exist as only an experience, Tier stitches parts of the piece together through citation to create distance between the poem and the speaker's experience. Citation in this poem appears in the form of direct quotation from scholarly texts. After walking the trail, the speaker wants to know the name of the grasses he encounters because he believes language is a way to create a connection between two things. But rather than represent this idea as something spontaneous, say, that emerges from the poem itself, Tier includes a quote from Luce Irigaray' The Way of Love. Quote, the aim of thought corresponds to the building of a bridge, practicable and mobile, between two subjects. Appearing to the left of the quote, in the side margins, is a bracketed in-text citation of the book. So while the quote itself offers an answer to the speaker's desire for naming, it also formally calls attention to itself as something foreign to the poem. We also see citation appear again when Tier tries to describe an interaction with an overdosing woman in the city that he cannot describe in his own language. Thus, he turns to an excerpt from Michel de Certeau's The Practice of Everyday Life. Quote, the concept city is decaying. Does that mean the illness affecting the rationality that founded it afflicts the urban population as well? In both instances of citation, the foreignness of that language begins to create a distance between the speaker and his experience. Simultaneously, the poem begins to separate itself from the realm of the reader's pure experience into one in which the poem exists on a separate plane as something with a distinct shape. In creating separation between the space of the poem and the space of the reader, Tall Flats Edge Notebook reflects Michael Fried's argument about the difference between art and an object. In Art and Objecthood, Fried claims that the difference between a successful painting and a non-artistic object is the desire to, quote, hold or stamp itself out or compel conviction as shape. For Fried, a work that tries to call attention to its shape means that it is asserting the fact that it has a shape separate from the space of the physical world around it. Fried calls the physical world a beholder inhabits, quote, literal space, while that of the picture can be considered pictorial. In pictorial space, the beholder knows she is separate from the painting, and in that separation, she sees the painting as having a shape that is made whole by multiple other forms within it. However, an object encountered in literal space is not separate from the reader's, or beholder's rather, experience. Put another way, all things one encounters in literal space become part of the experience of the object. The beholder cannot, and is not supposed to, distinguish between separate things within that space. While Fried's conclusion focuses mainly on the consequences of experience, it also suggests that the condition of art is spatial. In order to be a painting, pictorial space must be created and exist separately from literal space. Tyr's work acts out the separation of pictorial and literal space. The poem becomes a shapely thing precisely because it insists on highlighting its form and separating itself from the literal space it represents. In a Freudian sense, Tyr's work, quote, compels conviction as shape, but I would also say it compels conviction as space. In compelling conviction as space, which I would call an act of disarticulation, Tall Flats Edge Notebook allows readers to not simply experience the grasses and the people who roam the streets of San Francisco, but instead to wrestle with how those details help form the whole of the poem and the environments that they talk about. All right, let me swap to a different piece now. All right, this is Layli Long Soldier's piece We, which I'll talk about next. Much like Tyr's poem, Layli Long Soldier's piece We from her book Whereas formally manipulates space in an attempt to understand how language links people. In We, the speaker, a mother figure, remembers an event with her daughter when she used the subject pronoun we to describe an action she and her daughter performed together. However, the daughter is skeptical of that usage. For the rest of the poem, Long Soldier contemplates what the concept of we really means. Long Soldier visually simulates the separation of we by including a thick, black vertical line through the middle of the page. But what makes Long Soldier's approach fascinating to me is how it deals with abstraction. In Tyr's formal intervention, if Tyr's formal interventions highlighted the difference between aesthetic and literal space, Long Soldiers also do this, but her aesthetic additionally allows us to consider how formal techniques can turn abstract concepts into concrete ideas. As mentioned, we represents a type of disarticulation, the I from the we, but the force of that message emerges from the way readers are made to visualize it. The language on the page begins as long justified lines of prose that succinctly pose the problem the poem will investigate. Quote, because of our breath, a troop of marching ants blows from the page. We did this together, yet she doesn't like my use of we, the presumption. After these two sentences, the poem interrupts the prose with a vertical line that bisects the remaining language of the poem and creates a large gap between the first two whole lines and the final four segmented lines. The vertical line visually performs a disentangling of the two figures in the poem. At the beginning, the two are conjoined in the unbroken sentences, while at the end, the language is split into two different columns of text that can be read either separately or as a whole, much like a diptych. In the left column, the speaker refers to the vertical line as a, quote, rude inclusion that she shouldn't overstep. And she attempts to address you, who is the daughter, as you so as to center herself. You begins to exist in the left column as the speaker unweaves herself from that pairing in an effort to respect the boundaries between herself and this young, growing person. Over in the right column, the speaker discusses her path to finding herself. Quote, now I write, and to follow the line comfortably I pace. I go to retrace myself back. Thus, the speaker writes herself and retraces the lines she writes in order to see herself in them as something other than we. Thus, the inclusion of the vertical line achieves at least two things. One, it physically separates these characters, and two, it alters the language and thus the thinking of the speaker, resulting in a spatial and logical divide. By simulating this divide, Long Soldier engages in what Emilio Sarri would call the act of making the abstract concrete. Abstractions cannot normally be visualized. Love, for instance, cannot be seen. One knows it by feeling rather than by touching, smelling, or tasting a concrete image of it. According to Marx, the quote, concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the diverse. For Sarri, one of the goals of a work of art should be to, quote, alter our conception of the concrete itself, that is, to grasp society as the concentration of abstract determinations that ordinary perception fails to see. In other words, a host of abstractions people usually do not register create a unified whole, the concrete. And for Sarri, the political potential of a successful work of art rests in how well it can illuminate the abstract processes involved in building a society so that readers see and respond to them. Literature's force, then, rests in its ability to disarticulate experiences and events in order to show readers the otherwise invisible processes that create a shared world that they would otherwise not encounter in their private worlds. One of Long Soldier's goals in We is to focus the reader's attention on the way a mother begins to realize her child's otherness, but the way she succeeds is through her ability to highlight the processes involved in that separation, that abstraction. Though Long Soldier's poem includes no overt political message, its force comes from how its engagement with space makes what would otherwise be an abstract experience understandable. If the goal of a politics is to create visibility of one another so as to understand one and the other, how one and the other are enmeshed, then Long Soldier's poem exemplifies how formal restructuring can illuminate the conditions of our entanglement. Conclusion. To circle back to the original problem, if Greenwald Smith's overall claim about hybrid poetry is that it remains too focused on the subject and the commodity form at the cost of seeing other problems outside the subject, then poems like Tear and Long Soldiers suggest that with the right aesthetic approach, poetry still offers alternatives to that paradigm. In analyzing Tear and Long Soldiers' pieces individually, we begin to see how together their use of hybrid forms highlights the importance of space in multiple ways. In one sense, a poem must exist in a separate space from the literal space of a reader's world in order to highlight the many abstractions that take place in everyday experiences. This awareness also allows readers to see how they have been oriented. To be oriented is to be directed down a certain path toward a specific understanding. In other words, these poems create certain knowledge, but also show the process of that knowledge creation. Readers must place themselves in the poem and in moving through the space of the poem, gain a new perspective. In this way, an aesthetic of disarticulation is not only focused on disentangling concepts, but it is also concerned with how the construction of spaces orients the reader toward ways of knowing. Anna Kornbluh would call this view of form and space, quote, aesthetic thinking. In the order of forms, she suggests that, quote, form operates freedom. Every form is open to deployment, debate, and deformation. Every form performs elementary construction in the spirit of collective life. Forms in literature, then, build each world a reader encounters, which the reader then deconstructs to understand how they function to create the whole. They are free because, in Kornbluh's eyes, forms are, quote, contentless and can be used in conjunction with each other to create whatever object they desire. What Kornbluh hopes us to ultimately see in Tear and Long Soldier, then, is that an aesthetics of disarticulation and orientation can create awareness of how space is constructed and how to build other potentially better spaces. This aesthetic thinking further suggests that freedom is not a given, it is something built up. In building a collective world that does not rely on experience alone, but instead urges people to assess objects at a remove, people can more easily see how forms have been manipulated to perform certain functions and either change or reproduce them. What one hopes is that the resulting forms create more capacious spaces, while at the same time lay blueprints for how to continually build and rebuild as time moves forward. Thank you.
Thanks. Oh, these were extremely exciting papers. Okay, well, let's turn this over to questions and answers. Oh, okay, I can jump in. I have a question of both for Matthew and Christiane. And again, enjoy them both tremendously. Matthew, I was wondering, and this is something that you mentioned, the whole idea of framing briefly. I would love to hear more about it, because in the Freed quote that you included, one of the things that strikes me, and also thinking about, Richardson, autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, how do we know they're paintings? And then the response is, well, they're framed. And I wonder if that, how you see sort of framing devices, or in the cases of the poems that you talked about, shifts in frame as part of this disarticulation mechanism and reorientation. Because it seems, in other words, it seems like there's a lot, from the theoretical and how they are framed both spatially on the page, and you could have talked about that, how they are framed in terms of different discourses.
Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought up the idea of framing, because there's like a lot more in this chapter that I cut out for this presentation. But one of the other things that I go a lot more into detail about, that I think becomes, at least for me and what I write about, a very obvious kind of framing device, is a kind of metatextual reference to the self, right? Like Freed, I think, talks a lot about in art and objecthood, and then people like Walter Benjamin, not Walter Benjamin, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting my theorists right now because it's too early for me. But anyway, the point is that like the idea of metatextual language, on top of like the visual things that I sort of showed you, that kind of called into question the shape of the page, also call into question like the act of writing as a kind of like framing device that sets up our ideas. And so a lot of what I'm also interested in, with regard to this idea of framing, is like how language is mobilized to direct us in a certain way, to make a certain conclusion. But then I think what's revolutionary, to use, some of the other terms that we've all kind of thought about in each of our presentations, is the fact that that language also calls into question how it is a device that's being used in a specific way. And so when I think of framing, I like to think of it as sort of, or at least in this aesthetic that I'm trying to articulate, is that like it is a tool that both shows us what a space is, but it also shows us that space is something that is not a given around us, right? It is framed. It is something that makes us think in a certain way, and we are kind of like trapped in that. And so the way out of it is to recognize it and then keep using it and framing it in different ways. So that's only like slightly answering your question, but that's what I've got for you.
Actually, it does. And I suspected that might be something that the larger chapter discussed.
That's a great question.
Christiane, I don't know. I had some, again, both of these were marvelous presentations. I was struck by sort of the opening when you discussed about how this was a shift from, a Homeric epic form, and particularly the Odysseus one. And what struck me too was that it was a shift from the subject of the epic hero to the subject of the epic mechanism, which, is something that you get in post-World War II stuff. I think of Olson, Osiris Odysseus ship, for example, where that also allows you to transfer attention to the poetic vehicle itself, and how this got carried out in sort of this derogation of sort of, oh, we thought of this location as a Greek god, when there's a lot of parody on this Western classical tradition. But what happens in the shift from the epic hero to the vessel when it's a mechanical, the gear shifting and everything, when the mechanism is so much sort of emphasized, not just sort of the ship, but the mechanism of it, the machinery. What did you think about sort of at the start of that poem?
That's a wonderful question, Susan. Thank you so much. And again, I will attempt to answer this as someone who isn't the most familiar with poetics, as someone who works more in the nonfiction and autobiographical fiction area. But when we first encountered Rouge, we were really struck by the fact that De Leon is a very young poet. So in that opening poem, we couldn't decide if that was intentional purple poetry, he was intentionally mocking, or if this was a coincidental thing that we didn't necessarily want to touch on, simply because he is right around the corner from us as a fellow. He's actually done now. But I think in what he does there, he's really commenting on the satire of how, at least in Toronto, we speak about Scarborough as an area. So Scarborough, for anyone not from here, is a location that's often denigrated quite negatively all the time. It's a very densely immigrant populated area. It is now part of the city of Toronto after the 1998 amalgamation, yet it's always spoken of as this kind of hinterland. And that's even so in some more recent literature like David Cheriandy's brother, Catherine Hernandez's novel Scarborough itself. So I think in speaking about the mechanism here, I think he is intentionally bringing our attention to how we speak about certain areas and how we frame these spaces. So just to make a connection to what Matthew was just saying in the framing, I think De Leon uses this transference as a mechanism to bring our attention to this very specific way of talking about Scarborough. And as someone who grew up in an area like Scarborough, just on the other side of the city, I often too experience this moment where when I tell people where I grew up, it's oh, I'm so glad you got out of that area. When in reality, there's quite a bit going on in that community that I think to find very like wholesome and kind, not to romanticize it or idealize it too much, but in the same sense of, like De Leon pointing out, that we do talk about an area as a general. Let's focus in on the specifics and look at how we're framing that and what that does to the people there. I think that answered your question, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to throw this open to other questions.
So I had my hand raised in the Zoom. I don't know if you could see that or not. Hi, I'm James. I'm a PhD candidate here at University of Louisville. I have a comment for Matthew and a question for, I don't know if I caught the pronunciation, Christiana. Okay, I see you nodding. So just quick comment, Matthew, with these are both really interesting, or all of them are really interesting. With the citational poetics, I'm just going to say, if that's interesting to you, please come to the virtual keynote speaker today. It will be Victor Cabrera, who's a poet, contemporary poet from Mexico, and I'll be reading. It'll be a bilingual presentation, and that's his whole thing. Critics comment a lot. There are poems we're going to be reading today that are inspired by or engage with Mozart, Thelonious Monk, Japanese kaiju films, pretty much everything you can think of. High culture, low culture, popular culture. Obviously, a lot of references to Spanish language poetry. There are, incorporated phrases from Teresa de Avila and St. John of the Cross. So please come to that, is just what I'm going to say about that if you're interested in the idea of citational poetry or citational poetics at all. Intertextuality, self-referentiality, all these things. My question for Christiana is, I was really interested what you said about the idea of, and I'm not familiar with Toronto. I'm from Wisconsin, which is, getting up there and similar. But the idea of, subway lines, kind of everyday things being named after these high canonical literary authors like Kipling. And obviously with Kipling, there's this huge colonial context and baggage around that. But for me, for example, like I've lived in Spain, and one thing that I found so interesting about Spain is there'll be like sports stadiums named like, or airports named like the Cervantes, such and such, or um, the Miguel Delibes library, right? And I think it's so interesting because in the US, I always saw that as a positive thing, because in the US, a sports stadium is named like US Bank, whatnot, or, Miller High Life, whatever. So I found that as kind of more liberating or more emancipatory when I lived in Spain. Like, oh, literature can be more integrated into everyday life and even, institutions of society. I get where your author is coming from, and I get obviously around an author like Kipling, there's a lot of the colonial connotations. But do you have any just comments on, can literature be more of an everyday experience?
Yeah, that is actually a great question. Thank you so much, James. And as for the naming of US stadiums, I'm actually going to my first one in May. I think it's MetLife in New York. Very excited. Beyonce. Anyway, I think you pose a really good question in the sense of, can literature be included in everyday life? I think absolutely. It's a very pertinent discussion, specifically with the Association of Italian Canadian Writers that I'm working with recently. Most of the poets are bringing up the question, why isn't our Columbus Center having any notation of the poet's work on any of the official plaques? So I think that's a very pertinent discussion, because we seem to have references to art, to this, to that, and then always with the many sponsors and names that always prominently featured. So I do think that the literature definitely should be implemented. I think with De Leon, he's asking for a more intense look at who we are representing. So in Toronto specifically, our Dundas Square was actually just renamed Sankofta Square. Still in the transitionary period with that, but it was just moving away from the colonial history to, in this case, it's a Guyanese phrase about connectivity and collective belonging and membership. So I think with that, if we are going to be including literature and into naming and such, we should, absolutely. There's a definite beauty in that sense. But in some cases, we need to do a little bit more fact checking before we start using names with very deeply colonial histories and past like that. And in full transparency, it wasn't until doing the research for this presentation that I really started to look at some of the names and the connections to what they have, because I've been commuting 10 years to school. These are very mundane, everyday things. So again, with that idea of bringing the everyday into the artistic realm, I think that's also really, really important. And in conversations like this, I think we could really start discussing where literature is, where it can go, and how we can include it in a more day-to-day conversation outside of the classroom. Yeah, thanks, James. That was a really great question.
Great, thank you.
Go for it,
Maybe just-
Matthew. Yeah.
Oh, can I just add something on this particular part of the conversation? Yeah, it's funny, James, when the Kipling reference for some weird way that stuck out to me too in the talk, the wonderful talks. I totally agree. Awesome. But if I remember Christiane's comment, it was like Kipling equals colonialism. I forget, you'd have to go back and look at that part of the paper, but but I was struck by that because I was like, well, after, like, Christiane, you talked a little, what I'm getting at here has something to do with the status of the reader and kind of the status of a term, and the whether it has like a one-to-one relationship between the term and the meaning, and sort of this maybe trying to maybe embed or place the meaning of the term in relationship to a particular reader or interpreter or traveler. And so hearing your story, for example, in this Q&A, and like literally and figuratively where you're coming from, it seemed really important, and it's like trying to get away, I guess, the cliche of what was it, like the ideal reader or the universal reader or something like that in old-fashioned ways of reading. And your whole project and the project of this of the poetry that you're discussing is to kind of, challenge that and destabilize that and historicize and kind of, make us see as if for the first time, they're going to defamiliarize, that sort of thing. And so maybe that's just something like in a revision, because this is clearly a wonderful project and it's just great, though, everything. But to sort of like, well, Kipling, maybe, to be honest, it's been a long time since I've read Kipling, and I knew the colonial connection and all, but it's like a very plural term, Kipling. I mean, there's maybe somebody remembers a childhood story, maybe there's the working class Kipling, the Kipling who got into the voices of like ordinary individuals, maybe who were, exploited in war or something like that, who, I mean, it's like a resonant phrase, and as you say, it can either be not noticed at all, which is probably 90% of people, or it can be noticed, and understood and interpreted as like what you're doing as, a residue of colonialism, or it could be maybe a working class, poet, or whatever. So I would want to keep that an open, term, and also just the appreciation, like James said, again, it's like, what is it, the Baltimore Ravens? I mean, does Edgar Allan Poe, something like that? It's kind of cool, and there's sort of some literary references, but they're few and far between. And, it is kind of, again, like even having that little bit of a literary is sort of interesting. You see what I'm saying? I mean, it's like, I think maybe just embedding the commentary in maybe more of a, both the poet's subjectivity and perspective, and then you as the reader reading that, to me, it enriches and specifies in a way that I find meaningful and interesting. But, the whole idea of this project and looking at the subway stations and sort of connecting it to history of poets using, I mean, it's all amazing. So it's like incredible project.
Thank you so much. And you know what? I think you're completely right. This paper is actually in the current revision steps for publication with the American Review of Cultural Studies. But to your point, that's actually something one of our reviewers mentioned. We definitely did have to add that little bit of nuance because I think in its current form, it's a little too blunt. So definitely agree on that front. Because it is poetry, there is a way to look at things from multiple perspectives. So yeah, I completely agree. I think that's really a nuanced point, but thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan. And Matthew, did you have a hand up too?
I do. I'm like, we use Teams at UT Dallas, so I'm like not super familiar with how to raise my hand virtually on Zoom. But Christiane, I was really interested in the phrase that you mentioned in your paper. I think if I wrote it down correctly, it was make space of place. And I'm just so interested in what that means, because in my research of space and kind of the concept of space, space is this thing that's an expanse, and places are what makes space legible in a sense. At least I'm thinking of like Ian Davidson thinking about space as an expanse, with places like cities as things that turn it into something quote unquote meaningful. And so I'm interested in how like you're kind of not really inverting that sort of concept, but it almost sounds like it's the other way, like making space a place. It just really struck me. So I'm interested to hear what that really means, and sort of why, maybe just a little bit more in depth, that's so meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that question, Matthew. So my dissertation research is on suburban immigrant communities like that of Scarborough, and how this emerging literature, since I want to say around 2015, 2016, has really been using the novel, the poetry collection, the short story as a space to combat negative stereotypes and focus on these suburbs as spaces of creative resilience, of places for transculturation. So in my research looking at space as a tool to maybe challenge some of the reductive stereotypes that we just take at face value is really where I'm coming at from that. And I draw a lot of that from the research of one of my committee members, Dr. G.C. Zhuang. She takes third space in the physical sense of looking at how immigrant communities carve out their own independent spaces, renovating the current structures to create cultural pockets to make sure that they are included in the community, that they have the necessary resources to feel like they are active members. And these novels, in a lot of cases, and poetry collections are ways to talk about the experience of living in a place where they don't necessarily feel completely accepted without seeming ungrateful. It's just pointing out the way that they have come to make their own spaces. So I think what De Leon does in his space making is point out how we speak about Scarborough. For example, when we talk about an issue that happens in Toronto, it's always, at least in my experience, it's always talking about either the downtown core, where we give it a generality, versus when there's like a gang shooting in Scarborough, we're talking about the very specific intersection. We're talking about the community. We're definitely bringing up the social housing, the programs that are necessary there. So when we're doing that, I think we are, what De Leon's doing is pointing that out through his space making and challenging the way that we think about the production of certain places and spaces. So I was really drawn by your talk as well when you were talking about place and space, because it's something that has become a very large portion of my dissertation and my research lately. So that's also been really, really, it was really interesting to hear a different perspective, specifically from a poetic point of view. Yeah, did I answer your question?
No, yeah, that was really great. It seems like, you know, it's sort of the like movement you're talking about is, it's almost like disarticulation in a sense, right? Where it's like, you know, the place that of Scarborough is thought of in one way, but by like thinking about what the subway poetry is doing or what these other communities are doing or what has happened to them in this very specific way, you kind of carve out a space that these folks can, you know, be themselves in, like have themselves, while also still being part of this like larger whole. So if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly.
We joked amongst ourselves that we were creating a hybrid third space, a poetic third space. And I was like, okay. It felt very reminiscent of my comprehensive exams talking about Homi Bhabha and Edward Sucha. So that was, yeah, that was a great
Yes.
question.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yeah, that was a great answer.
If you don't mind, I actually do have a question for Susan. So that was a wonderful talk. I really loved listening to a narrative about Southern Ontario as someone who could take a quick drive there about 2 hours away. One thing you said that really struck me was this silence to say goodbye as this like cautionary tale. In previous research, I always looked at silence as an act of resistance. Is there any way in this particular setting that silence could be considered a form of resistance, a form of not contributing to this virus and potential mutations, maybe?
Oh, absolutely. And the phrase is Burroughs. And that's why I'm saying that a lot of the more optimistic readings about there's a cure through language, I wonder a little bit about it, because in Burroughs there is not that much optimism about that kind of thing. Even as he, you know, does these marvelous experiments, but still all the cut up and the ticket that exploded is the prelude to creating a space, if you want, for that silence to say goodbye. And yes, silence is, and one of the things I think Pontypool and all of the Pontypools do so well is dramatize that tension. I think that they are repeatedly reminded, not translating because English is supposed to be the language, although a lot of things in the text question whether it's only English. Dr. Mendez's Armenian, for example, they can't tell if he's still infected. And the initial opening monologue, which is this wonderful metonymic play in French and English on the town's name, and all sorts of punning sort of jokes about it. That if that started the infection, then I'm not sure that the French is necessarily safe. But I think there's a recognition that we can't speak, or in the novel, humans resort to just nodding. Even sign language isn't. So there's a tremendous sense in which the silence is a resistance, and also a tremendous sense in which humans can't stop. In the radio script, which is so sad, he winds up killing Sydney because he says, he strangles her. He says, you cannot stop a human being from talking unless you stop them from breathing. And I think of Burroughs and his whole book of breathing, and this tension between the visual and the and the word. So I think it really dramatizes Burroughs' sense of how difficult it is to achieve that silence. And I was wondering if, that was kind of the paper's conclusion. What silences could we build in Contagion, other possibilities of silences that might let something like the non-human speak or communicate? What silences could we really build into our poetics that might be a more effective resistance to the virus? So that's a fantastic question. And again, looking at the Burroughs, Burroughs would really agree with you on that.
So thank you so much, Susan.
Do we have other questions? Okay, if not, then thank you all for coming to the panel, and again, thank you for participating. Yeah, oh, Dan, great.
And I just Matthew, toward the end of your talk, this is just informational. You referenced a theorist, I think, about aesthetic thinking. And it might have been the idea of aesthetics of disarticulation. Was that the Kornblau? I didn't know who you had, since that sounded really interesting to me. I wanted to follow up on that. Can you give me a reference there?
Yeah, it's
Or-
Anna Kornblau's The Order of Forms.
Okay.
So yeah, I was working mainly with the way that she talks about like this idea. The idea of aesthetic thinking is that one kind of thinks in a way that like recognizes the forms that build like all of the sort of processes around us, right? From, the forms that structure our universities, right? Like realizing that thing A, points us in the direction of thing B, blah, blah, so on and so forth. And then kind of, she, of course, is a literary theorist, so she's thinking about it in terms of, different texts throughout the rest of that manuscript. But yeah, this idea of aesthetic thinking, I'm kind of using that to really think about how we can maybe better attend to the spaces, whether they're in poetry or in our everyday lives. Yeah.
All right, are there other questions? These are terrific questions.
Susan, I have a question for you, and I don't know if you have an answer because it's the question that you posed at the end of your paper, but your response to Christiane and this idea of silence and sort of like, is silence a way of resisting, that makes me question what we're all doing as literary people creating texts. And I will be the first to admit I don't read a lot of Burroughs, but it seems like this is a thing that always comes up, in thinking about his text when I hear people talk about it. So, what can we do as a discipline to attend to silence?
I think it's always a good praxis in any field to sort of attend to silences, to the gaps, to the pauses, whether that's the gutter space in comics, whether the pauses in music. But I guess I come at this a little bit because, again, remember, Pontypool speaks very directly to me because I love experimental print and digital poetry, and I love biopoetry, and I have questions about, again, the methodologies sometimes need to be interrogated. Katz's Genesis, for example, and in other words, can we keep that focus on the non-human? Can we create more silences? Can we somehow remove I guess at least some of the human engineering process from it? What are the ways in which we could, whether it is forms of eco-poetry, biopoetry? Are there ways in which we could be somewhat less intrusive in the production? And to be fair with Katz, what he's doing when he has bioengineered forms is to raise questions about the ethics of bioengineered forms. But as many of his scholars have pointed out, you know, it's the Audre Lorde question, and Catherine Hales poses this: can the master's tools dismantle the master's house? So, you know, I wonder sort of the new sort of forms of eco-poetry that might make even greater use of the silences. And I think in particular to the question of where can poetry go in the Anthropocene, I would love to see sort of looking for the pauses, the silences, in places where the non-human can communicate.
Thank
And again,
you.
I'm not sure what that would look like right now, but I'm hoping, I'm hoping we go there. Any other questions or issues that people would like to bring up, or references that you'd like to note in a chat comment? Okay, we're good. All right, great. Again, thank you so much for coming.